exclusively on Secular Media Network. This is the Gaytheist Manifesto.
Hello and welcome to the Gaytheist Manifesto, your source for news, commentary, discussion, and debate at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. I am your host, Callie Wright, and thank you so much for joining me once again. For 3 of the past 4 weeks, I've had the immense honor and privilege of traveling to different parts of the country to take part in various and awesome events. September 11th through 13th was the Pennsylvania State Atheist Humanist Convention, where I got to meet lots of awesome atheist community folks for the first time, and I got to spend some great quality time with my friends Bill and Susie Robbins from the Barroom Atheist podcast, my good friend Chris from the Atheist podcast, and that's the Canadian form of A, and his new wife Corinne, who, those are all folks that I absolutely adore. And you got to hear some of the fruits of that conference in episode 31, which was titled Stories from God and PA. And as you heard in the last episode, I spent the weekend 2 weeks later in Montgomery, Alabama, with my friends Nick and Zandy celebrating reproductive freedom. And I rounded things out with the Carolina Secular Convention in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina last weekend. We braved the hurricane weather and flooding and managed to have an absolutely amazing conference filled with some really great talks and some really good times with people who are absolutely my family. Last week's episode where I talked about my trip to Montgomery didn't include audio of the talk that I gave there because I didn't quite have it together yet. Well, I have that audio here for you on the show today. So without further ado, here it is, my talk from the V to Shining V event on September 26, 2015. Yay! Make everybody deaf. That's sweet. My name is Callie Wright. I do a podcast called the Gaytheist Manifesto. I am an LGBT activist. I'm an atheist activist. And my podcast kind of covers the intersection of those two issues. And honestly, it's kind of intimidating to be here because where I am, those things aren't super, super controversial, but you guys are down here like on the front lines, so like I'm kind of intimidated, like this is awesome. So, I am in fact a loud and proud, unashamed transgender woman, and stoked on all that as you may be, you may be politely asking yourself why a trans person is speaking at a women's reproductive health benefit. I don't have a uterus for Roy Moore or Robert Bentley to stick their grubby little hands in. Gross. But when Sandy told me, this thing was happening, I said that I wanted to come down and meet Nick in person for the first time and hang out with her because I love both of them dearly. And she asked me if I would speak, and what else can a raging narcissist do but take advantage of the opportunity? So, raise your hand if you're a fan of intersectionality, right? Yeah! Yay, intersectionality! So, I'm transgender, I'm bisexual, I'm female, I'm atheist, so intersectionality is kind of my thing. Yeah. So I'm all about exploring the different ways that all of these social justice causes interact with each other, and exploring all the things that are different, and exploring all the things that are the same about the fights we fight, and the people who have decided to give a shit about making the world suck less for ourselves and our community. So let's hear it for giving a shit, right? Yeah. So the fight for access to safe and legal abortion and easy access to contraceptives isn't in itself a super, super personal fight for me. I traded my baby-making abilities in for these guys. So, that being said, if you think for a second about what is the argument at the center of the abortion rights debate,
It's not about fetal personhood. It's not about when a heart starts beating. It's not about when a fetus can feel pain. It's not about people having sex irresponsibly. It sure as hell is not about what God wants. My friends, the only relevant argument in the debate over access to safe and legal abortion and access to contraception is the question of whether or not a person's body belongs to them.
Yeah.
Are you and you alone the only person who gets to make decisions about your own body and your own health? Does the government have the right to force you into any situation that compromises your agency and your autonomy?
No.
No.
There it is. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that your bodily autonomy and your agency are the most basic of basic human rights. If there's nothing else in this life that truly and completely belongs to you, your body should. We have in this country a repeated and prolonged history of enumerating the rights of corporations, of gun owners, of business owners, of the religious, and very little for women. In many places in this country, it's easier to get a gun than an abortion, and that's a fucking travesty. And my friends, speaking as a transgender person, that debate, those questions, and the consequences that flow from them are something I'm intimately familiar with. What we as trans people choose to do or not do with our own bodies is constantly under the scrutiny and questioning of the public, of government officials, our families, and even our own healthcare providers. We are one of a very select few groups of people who are more familiar with educating our healthcare providers on our needs than we are finding anyone who knows anything about it. So I'm sure everyone's heard the asinine argument about that abortion and contraception aren't medical care, right? So that's one that I'm actually kind of familiar with. Even under the Affordable Care Act, it's still legal to have a blanket exemption for any transition-related care. Many insurance policies spell out in plain English that they refuse to cover anything at all related to transition, and you'd be shocked at how far they'll go once they have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria to work with. There's a story of a trans woman who broke her arm playing in an LGBT softball league. Her insurance company refused to cover her broken arm because it was an LGBT softball league, and they figured, well, that's transition related. But my personal favorite, and by favorite I mean the one that makes me most want to crawl into a hole and die, a trans woman suffered a coronary event due to prolonged stress in dealing with her insurance company, trying to get her needs taken care of. And the insurance company acknowledged their responsibility in this coronary event so they could deny coverage for her EKG because it was transition-related. The logic, of course, being that fighting for transition-related care caused the event, therefore the EKG was transition-related. I sincerely wish I was making this shit up. In many places, trans women still feel compelled to wear the thickest makeup and the girliest clothes to their therapist appointments because they fear the therapist may deem them not trans enough to approve their hormone treatments or their surgeries. If a trans person suffers from depression, anxiety, or any other mental health issue, often we're withheld transition-related care until we can prove that we have that other stuff under control. And this completely ignores the fact that gender dysphoria is often the direct cause of those conditions and that transition-related care can mitigate and sometimes even cure those things. We feel compelled to lie to our mental health providers in order to keep access to these things. We're compelled to live the most heteronormative lives we can possibly live, or at least pretend to. There's a story of a trans woman whose therapist wouldn't write a letter recommending her for bottom surgery because she identified as a lesbian. And we all, of course, know that a woman can't live in society without a husband, right? Yeah? I think another one of my favorite anti-choice arguments is about personal responsibility and the use of abortion as birth control. And of course, we know that consent to sex is not consent to pregnancy. And of course, this assumes that consent is even involved because so many of our friends down the street here like to pretend that rape doesn't happen, I guess. And this argument reminds me of how many times I've been told that I chose to be the way that I am, and that any step that I take to medically transition is the moral equivalent of like a vain rich woman getting a boob job just because. And of course my response is, well, yeah, of course I chose to be like this. I woke up one day on Tuesday morning and I said, you know what would be sweet? I'm going to toss a live hand grenade into the middle of my otherwise ideal white middle-class male existence and risk my friendships, my family relationships, my job, my financial security, my mental and physical health, because holy shit, does that sound fun. I was so stoked when I lost my job over transition. I was psyched beyond belief when my aunt who helped raise me just refused to even discuss the issue with me and told me that she would never accept me as Catholic. And I was downright giddy when my grandma dismissed the LGBT movement that's given me life as nothing more than a ploy to drag people away from God. Doesn't all this sound super badass? And just as I'm sure that you all wish that our friends Roy Moore and Robert Bentley could actually experience pregnancy for a day, I would fucking love to give those assholes gender dysphoria for a day. And they would rush to make transition-related care as ubiquitous as they would rush to make abortion care if they had to worry about unwanted pregnancy. These are all reasons that despite the fact that I can never get pregnant and I'll never need an abortion, that I take the issue of reproductive rights very personally. When a male-dominated society tells a woman what she can and can't do with her reproductive system, it's as personal to me as when one of my trans sisters is told that she needs a man to live life normally in society. It's as personal to me as when an insurance company takes our money and promises us health care, but tells us that the therapy, the hormones, and the surgeries that we need aren't really necessary. The message we constantly receive from the society we live in and our elected officials is that our bodies and our lives aren't our own. That we belong to men, that we belong to God, that we belong to anyone but ourselves. I don't know about you, but I'm done with that bullshit. I would never claim that abortion and transgender rights are the same issue. I'm not a fan of appropriating other people's struggles. But what I hope I've laid out here is that our respective causes are fighting to manifest the same basic idea. That women's bodies belong to no one but them, and that their healthcare decisions belong between them and their doctors. So let's continue to stand together and fight to see the day when our rights are seen as sacrosanct and inviolable, and for the day when events like this are no longer necessary. Thank you.
And that was my talk from the V to Shining V event in Montgomery, Alabama on September 26th. Coming up after this break, I'm going to have the audio from my Gaytheism 101 talk at the Carolina Secular Convention this past weekend. I'm going to take a quick break, and I'll have that for you right after this on the Gaytheist Manifesto.
The staff of Secular Coalition for America lobbies U.S. Congress on issues of separation of church and state, and they've become a powerhouse for change in the United States government. You'll definitely want to subscribe to receive their email action alerts. These are updates for important issues and ones that you can get involved with directly. And hopefully, you'll consider making a contribution to the Secular Coalition for America to help them continue fighting for your equality. You can do it all at secular.org.
Before we jump back into the show, it's time to thank our patrons. No new patrons this week, but I recognize that when one of our patrons started, I used the incorrect name in thanking them. So here's to you, Ari. Thank you again, and sorry, love you. Thank you so much for believing in us enough to contribute to us financially and for being a part of this movement. Patrons of the Gaytheist Manifesto have access to all sorts of cool stuff, like a big shout out on the show, premium content, including an audio journal I've decided to keep documenting the more personal stuff I don't dive into on the show, and an exclusive patrons-only hangout once a month. If you're so inclined, head over to patreon.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto to become a part of this movement and support the show. Thank you. Welcome back to the Gaytheist Manifesto. On October 3rd, 2015, this past weekend, I delivered my first ever talk at an atheist convention at the Carolina Secular Convention in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. It was wet and rainy and just not generally as pretty as you would expect Myrtle Beach to be. But that's okay, because I got to spend some amazing quality time with some people who are truly like family to me. My good friend Hugh Man, friend of the show, Hugh Man, Bobby and Ashley from the No Religion Required podcast, Bill and Susie from the Barroom Atheist podcast, Gene Elliott from the Atheist Avengers podcast, and the organizer of ReasonCon, which was the first convention I ever went to, and they're just all amazing people. And Shelley Siegel too. I got to meet Shelley for the first time the day before the Pennsylvania State Atheist Humanist Convention. I had the pleasure and honor of hanging out at Bill and Susie's house the night before the con, getting to see Shelley play in a living room in front of just about, I think there were maybe 7 or 8 of us there. And it was a really cool night, private concert with Shelley, hanging out with her, talking about Australian politics and why American biscuits are disgusting, and just, learning about her story and telling some of my story, and just it's really cool when she does intimate concert events like that. She likes to intertwine the music with the storytelling, and she'll say, "Hey, this is what I wrote this song about. Does anybody have a story that's similar to this?" And it almost turns into sort of an atheist discussion group. And it was just a really, really cool experience. And so after the con Saturday night, a bunch of us went to the bar and we hung out, and Shelley brought her guitar, and the later it got, the more drinks all of us had. And we had another sort of little private concert there in the bar. And it was, at the end of the night, it was Shelley, her manager Natalie, who was also awesome. Had a good time getting to know her. And then, Bill, Susie, Bobby, Ashley, Jean, and myself. And we had sort of another private concert. And we had the bartender, Lewis. Even the bartender was into it. The bartender loved us. And he loved Shelley. And we got to close the night out with Shelley's song, Gratitude, which I think is an amazing song. God, I'm getting teary-eyed just thinking about it. I cry over everything. I'm such a girl. But it's a song that talks about how, even though we don't believe in God and we know that this is the only life that we live, and, sometimes it can be tough to accept that one day we're just not going to exist anymore, and one day that the people that we love, we're just not going to exist anymore. But we can still be grateful for the lives that we lead, and for the experiences that we have, and for the presence of good friends and good families, and and the times that we get to share together. So there was just this really cheeseball moment where all of us in the room were holding hands with each other, even Lewis, the bartender, and singing along and swaying back and forth and smiling and hugging each other and telling each other just how much we loved each other. And it was a brilliant moment, an absolute brilliant moment. But earlier in the day, I gave my talk at 2 p.m., introduced by MC Mark Nebo, who is a gentleman and a scholar. The guy thought to ask my pronouns before introducing me, which was a super, super classy thing to do. And I greatly appreciated that. So I'm going to stop waffling around here, and I am going to play for you my talk, which was entitled Gaytheism 101, from October 3rd, 2015 at the Carolina Secular Convention. Good afternoon. Everybody get lunch okay? Good? Awesome. So, before I start, a couple of thank yous. This is the first talk I've ever given at a conference, so I'm super excited to be here. So, thank you to Jennifer and all the people who put the conference together for having me. My talk is also sponsored by this freaking guy, Joey Kirkman. His new book, PR Pope, is out. It's back there at the table. You should go buy it because it's awesome. So, my talk is called Gaytheism 101. So, because this is my first conference talk, you're probably asking yourselves, who the hell am I? And that's cool. So, my name is Callie, and I host a podcast called The Gaytheist Manifesto, where we explore the intersection of atheist and LGBT activism. I am a transgender and queer woman. We'll discuss those words later. I'm also an activist.
I'm involved in a few different organizations locally. I'm on the Cincinnati Steering Committee for the Human Rights Campaign, which is the country's largest LGBT civil rights organization. I also sit on the board of an organization called Heartland Trans Wellness, which is a Midwestern organization that does advocacy, support, education for trans people living in the Midwest. I'm also probably the biggest Star Trek fan you've ever met. The answer to your next question is Benjamin Sisko. Debate me, I'll win. Thank you. So, before I jump into the talk, I do want to say some of the stuff that I talk about is pretty heavy. I'm going to be talking about stuff like suicide, death, depression, anxiety, losing loved ones. So if it gets to be too much, please don't be afraid to go take care of yourself. So I started my podcast for two reasons. One, when I came out and started being involved in the LGBT community, I was shocked to find myself being preached at, sometimes aggressively, at LGBT-themed events. And the other side of it is that when I started being involved in the atheist movement, there just aren't that many queer or trans voices speaking in the movement. And there are definitely some of us out there, and they do great work, so I'm not trying to downplay that. But there aren't enough of us, let alone people who speak about transgender issues. So I decided that my thing is going to be atheist outreach to the LGBT community and LGBT outreach to the atheist community, because I think that sort of intersection gives you a unique view on life that I like to call the Gaytheist experience. No, really? Really? I worked really hard on that joke. So, let's define a few terms first. And these aren't necessarily vital to the presentation or anything like that, but some terminology that's just good to have in your back pocket. So the first word is queer. Queer is a word that has some baggage attached to it. It used to be just a slur. But now basically it's just used as an umbrella term for anyone who's not heterosexual. So homosexual, bisexual, pansexual, so on and so forth. It's just an umbrella term. Transgender. A transgender person is someone whose gender identity is incongruent with their birth-assigned sex. For example, I was born, the doctor saw a penis and said, boy, and I grew up and said, no. Gaytheism. Gaytheism is a made-up word. I didn't make it up, but I love it. And basically it just describes the intersection of the issues facing LGBT and atheist communities. Intersectionality. This is a big one. I could probably do a whole presentation on intersectionality. But basically, it's a concept that's used to describe ways in which shitty social constructs like isms and phobias are interconnected and not all somehow magically separate issues. For example, as a transgender person, I'm statistically more likely than the average person to experience hate-related violence. If I happen to be a trans person of color, that risk would be greatly multiplied. So those things intersect to navigate the way that to change the way that we navigate the world. This graphic is kind of a good illustration of that. It's not comprehensive, but you kind of get the idea. And intersectionality kind of defines the sort of activism that I do, because I don't necessarily look at atheist and LGBT activism as completely separate things. So, why? Why atheism and LGBT? Why does it make sense for these two things to go together? Well, in short, there are a lot of reasons. So I'm going to tell you a story. Raise your hand if you recognize her. So this is, of course, Leila Alcorn. She's a 17-year-old transgender girl. She committed suicide on December 28th, 2014. And she auto-posted her suicide note to Tumblr. And in her suicide note, she described being rejected by her parents, being isolated from her friends, being sent to religious conversion therapy, and eventually she chose to end her life. This is a picture of a vigil that we held for Leila in Cincinnati. She's from Cincinnati, where I live. She was part of our community. And there were about 400 people there. And it was an amazing thing to see. I never thought that I would see that many people show up for the trans community. And at these events, usually there are LGBT-affirming clergy there. And I don't begrudge those folks being there. There are people in our community who need that. And I don't see events like this as a place necessarily for a religious debate. So I usually just nod my head and ignore it. But there was a minister speaking there, and she used the words verbatim, "I believe God was a first responder on the highway that day," which might be the most disgusting thing I've ever heard in my life. Because that implies that her God stood by while her parents rejected her, isolated her from her friends, tortured her with conversion therapy, watched her walk onto the highway, and watched as the truck hit, and then decided to show up. How about fuck you? And that was the moment that I knew that for me, LGBT activism and atheist activism had to be a thing that happened together. I couldn't separate the two. So, the Gaytheist Manifesto was born. And so we all know the obvious stuff, right? Like religious-inspired bigotry. Obviously, not all religious people are bigots, but the ones who are definitely quoting directly from the book. So, the way that I see it, atheist activism is sort of LGBT activism by proxy. And it's not just because, generally speaking, religions take a dim view of queer and trans people. We've read, we're an abomination, having sex with our partners deserves the death penalty, that we just, in general, deserve death. But show of hands, who here was once really, really religious or fundamentalist or extremist? Okay, now keep your hands up. Keep your hands up. Okay, so now keep your hand up if you snapped out of it overnight and just woke up one day and said atheist. Right. Of course you didn't. But why? Why didn't you snap out of it right away? The answer, at least in part, is identity. When you were a fundamentalist or even just a devoutly religious person, your religion was you, right? It's an almost inseparable part of your identity from the rest of you. Atheists like to scoff at religious people who take religious debates so personally because, generally speaking, we like to say that we can separate the person from the beliefs and that criticizing your religion isn't necessarily criticizing you as a person. But the problem is that for believers, for many or most of them, their religion is a deep-seated part of their identity as a human being. And when you attack someone's religion, they may often feel the same way that I feel when someone says something horrible about gay people or about trans people. And you and I know that those aren't the same thing, but we're not having this debate with you and I. So the point is, because for many religious people, their beliefs are their identity. And though you and I know that your religious beliefs and your gender identity and sexual orientation, those things don't belong in the same category, for them it often does. And leaving that behind requires a shift in the way that they view their identity. Losing your religion oftentimes is trading in the identity that you grew up with, the one that you were told from day one by your parents, by your friends, your teachers, your society, and the media, was not only the right identity, but the default one. And that any identity other than Christian or Muslim or Jewish or whatever religion is inherently wrong and deviant. And even in some slightly more tolerant places, you can be an atheist, but you better not talk about it, because just the fact that you exist is offensive. Who recognizes this person? No? Okay, all right. Well, given the context of the presentation, I figured everyone would get yeah, okay, it's a pre-transition picture of me. So, oh, thank you. And this is, of course, a really, really superficial way to make the point, because changes in me have gone far deeper than physical transition. But the drastic difference that you see in my physical appearance, it pretty closely maps to the difference I feel in myself, from being more comfortable in my own skin, relating to people better than I ever have, feeling feelings in a way that I've always felt like I should. I could probably do an entire presentation on all of the things that have changed in me since coming out and pursuing transition. Now, the point that I'm trying to make here is that the difference I described in myself since embracing my identity as a trans person is quite often the same change I hear people describe when leaving religion. Conversely, many of the consequences for coming out are very similar, if not the same.
Since I've gotten into activism, I've heard so many coming out stories and so many deconversion stories, and it's freaky how similar they are. The good and the bad. The struggles, the hard conversations, the tears, the fighting, the questioning yourself and everything you know. And on the other side, the joy of finally being able to honestly be yourself, to live your truth and be comfortable with the person you are. Now, the thing to know about me is that I didn't grow up in a super oppressive, fundamentalist religious environment. When I decided I was atheist around 16 or 17 or so, it just wasn't a big deal, even to my fundamentalist religious grandma. Wasn't a big deal at school, wasn't a big deal among my friends. My parents didn't care. Nobody cared. I was a teenager before I figured out what religious sentiments towards the LGBT community generally are. Anybody else remember when Ellen DeGeneres came out as gay? Right, okay. So I will never forget that week ever as long as I live. I was still going to church with my grandma at the time. And that Sunday, the preacher was preaching from the pulpit about Ellen DeGeneres coming out and how evil being gay is and so on and so forth. And he talked about these companies that had pulled their advertising from Ellen's show as a result of her coming out. And one of these companies was Wendy's. So guess where Grandma and I went for lunch after church that day? Where she was absolutely sure to let the 16-year-old girl working the drive-thru know that we were there to celebrate their firm stand on morality. I was 13 years old. And so because I didn't grow up in a super oppressive religious environment, a lot of this stuff was kind of lost on me. Even after starting the podcast, I didn't really get how deep this connection can be. It took getting involved in the atheist community and listening to people who came from those environments for me to really get it. So, to elicit the same reaction that I had from you when I figured that whole thing out, I want to play a game. I'm going to show you several quotes on struggling with religious, sexual, or gender identity, but with certain identifying words taken out. And I want to see if you can spot the difference. It makes you feel inferior, like you're not quite human. I turn my head and people can't hear me anymore. I kept it to myself for a long time because I was afraid to talk to other people about it. I've been so careful about hiding stuff from my dad, but he saw my today. He preached at me for hours and I've had panic attacks ever since. I knew if I came out, I would lose my job. I pretend to be just to be accepted by my best friends. I pretend to be at work because my boss is really conservative. My dad told me my sister got cancer because I don't know what to do. I think my husband knows. He'll make me leave if he finds out. I can't lose my kids, but I don't know how long I can keep this up. It's creepy, isn't it? So, now that my persuasive powers have thoroughly convinced you of this intersectionality between religious gender and sexuality, or between religion and gender and sexuality, you may be asking yourself, why does this all matter so much? After all, the last few years have been really great for the LGBT movement, right? All throughout 2014 and the first half of 2015, courts ruled again and again in favor of the right of gay people to be married, leading up to the Supreme Court ultimately deciding in favor of gay marriage on June 26, 2015. On June 9th, 2014, Time magazine featured a trans woman, Laverne Cox, on their cover for the first time. Right? Isn't she hot? In July, she became the first transgender actor to be nominated for an Emmy Award. In January of 2015, the Amazon series Transparent won a Golden Globe for Best Television Comedy or Musical. In 2015, President Obama became the first president to mention transgender people in a State of the Union address. Defense Secretary Ashton Carter announced the military's planned lifting of the ban on transgender people serving openly in the U.S. military. And of course, we can't forget about Caitlyn Jenner. But, and you knew this part was coming, right? We have a long way to go. And I'm going to tell you two stories
to illustrate this point. The case that eventually made it to the Supreme Court that decided on marriage equality for me and for every other queer person who wants it has another story. And it's a story that you don't hear super often in the media, but I think it's one that's equally important, if not more important, to tell. On your right is Jim Obergefell, and on the left is his husband, John Arthur. They'd been together for about 20 years, which, of course, we know being gay is a phase, right? It's a long time. So they talked about marriage but never talked seriously. They wanted their marriage to have the same legal recognition as anyone else's. In 2011, John was diagnosed with ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease, which, for those who don't know, is a degenerative disease that eventually robs you of your ability to control your body and eventually takes your life. In 2013, the Supreme Court struck down a key provision of the Defense of Marriage Act, conferring legal benefits, federal benefits, to legally married same-sex couples. Jim read the headline, leaned over, kissed John on the forehead, and said, "Let's get married." But, being, as I am, from Ohio, they still couldn't get legally married. So they chose Maryland, I guess because it was the closest state at the time that had legalized marriage equality. But by then, John was almost on his deathbed. So a Facebook campaign raised $13,000 for a special medical transport to get them to Maryland. And when the plane landed, they were married on the tarmac. And because Ohio is, in fact, the worst state ever, that's not where Jim and John's journey ended. Eventually, they recognized that because their marriage wasn't legal in Ohio, that Jim's name wouldn't be on John's death certificate as his surviving spouse, and that their family burial plot wouldn't allow them to be buried together because their marriage wasn't legally recognized in Ohio. And that's why they filed suit. And there are, of course, many, many details in between, but the long and short of it is that Jim's case, along with three others, eventually made it to the United States Supreme Court and won marriage equality for all of us. Yeah. The story that doesn't often get told is that John Arthur didn't live to see that day. He lost his fight with ALS 3 months after they got married. So, God, I've rehearsed this presentation like 10 times and it makes me cry every time. Jim had to celebrate his victory without John at his side. So we won a great victory for sure, but it's worth keeping in mind the damage that was done and that continues to be done by discrimination like this. And that their fight, the fight that's famous and will go down in history forever, started because a couple wanted to be treated equally in death, not in life, and that one of them didn't make it to see it the day when they actually won. So you heard me earlier on mention Leila Alcorn, the 17-year-old transgender girl who committed suicide after being rejected by her parents and sent to conversion therapy. She auto-posted her suicide note to Tumblr, like I said, and this is the part that gets difficult. I'm going to read some highlights from her suicide note. When I was 14, I learned what transgender meant and cried of happiness. After 10 years of confusion, I finally understood who I was. I immediately told my mom, and she reacted extremely negatively, telling me that it was a phase, that I would never truly be a girl, that God doesn't make mistakes, that I am wrong. If you're reading this, parents, please don't tell this to your kids. Even if you're Christian or against transgender people, don't ever say that to someone, especially your kid. That won't do anything but make them hate themselves. That's exactly what it did to me. My mom started taking me to a therapist, but would only take me to Christian therapists who were all very biased. So I never actually got the therapy I needed to cure me of my depression. I only got more Christians telling me that I was selfish and wrong and that I should look to God for help. I formed a sort of fuck you attitude towards my parents and came out as gay at school, thinking that maybe if I eased into coming out as trans, it would be less of a shock. Although the reaction from my friends was positive, my parents were pissed. They felt like I was attacking their image and that I was an embarrassment to them. They wanted me to be their perfect little straight Christian boy. That's obviously not what I wanted. So they took me out of public school, took away my laptop and my phone, and forbid me of getting on any sort of social media, completely isolating me from my friends. This was probably the part of my life when I was the most depressed, and I'm surprised I didn't kill myself. I was completely alone for 5 months. No friends, no support, no love, just my parents' disappointment and the cruelty of loneliness. I've decided I've had enough. I'm never going to transition successfully, even when I move out. I'm never going to be happy with the way I look or sound. I'm never going to have enough friends to satisfy me. I'm never going to have enough love to satisfy me. I'm never going to find a man who loves me. I'm never going to be happy. Either I live the rest of my life as a lonely man who wishes he were a woman, or I live my life as a lonelier woman who hates herself. There's no winning. There's no way out. Now, there was a worldwide outpouring of love and support for Leela and for the transgender community. We held 2 vigils in Cincinnati as a memoriam for her. And they even got as far away as the UK. And this was kind of hailed as a sort of come to Jesus, no pun intended, given the company, it's sort of a come to Jesus moment for society regarding transgender issues. And the phrase that you would hear over and over and over again is that, this is such an awful situation, but, people are finally talking, and that's at least something. The problem here is that a 17-year-old girl had to commit suicide before that happened. Many trans kids who already feel like their lives are worth nothing because no one seems to care about them, they see a note like Leela's where she admonished us to fix society, and she was turned into memes and hashtags and on the news everywhere. The message that these kids get is that that's what they have to do before their lives matter. They'll get the love and support they crave if they kill themselves. Now, reading Leela's suicide note absolutely wrecked me for a few different reasons. Obviously, this was the last writing of a 17-year-old who had committed suicide, and that's sufficiently tragic on its own, knowing no other details of the story. But to know that religion played a part, if not the whole part, in the situations that led to it, the Alcorns are people, I have no doubt, who genuinely love their kid. The problem was that they had God blinders on. And those God blinders let them ignore the hurting child in front of them in favor of what they wanted their God's plan for their child to be. Now, the other reasons that her note hit me so hard were more personal. The last bit where she talked about not being able to find a life worth living, even post-transition, that hit me like a punch in the stomach. It's largely that fear that kept me in the closet until I was 28. Would I be outright rejected by the people that I love? Would I be an object of pity, getting pats on the back for having courage to be me, but having my entire life reduced to just this one facet of my identity? Would I ever be happy with the way I looked or sounded as a woman? Would I feel like an imposter for the rest of my life because of the way that my body looks? I remember driving home from work one night when things were particularly bad and thinking, man, I could probably figure out a way to crash my car so no one would know that I actually killed myself, and it would just look like an accident. And I remember going to bed night after night thinking, maybe I just won't wake up tomorrow. That wouldn't be the worst thing. Now, lest you think I came here simply to depress you, there is another side to all of this. Hearing many folks talk about their experiences as queer or trans people can sometimes make it sound like it's an abjectly miserable experience. And frankly, sometimes it is. Having hate directed at you is exhausting. Hearing news stories about trans people committing suicide every other day tears me apart. And hearing people preach allyship and turn around and act against me really hurts. But if I want someone to take a single thing away from my story, from any difference that I'm part of making in this world, from anything that I accomplish, it's that I'm not exceptional. Despite the challenges that we face from the world, from ourselves, from our society, given support from our friends, our families, and our communities, and with access to competent medical care, we can and do thrive. Anytime someone is complimentary of me for being so open and honest with my story, I always remind them there is no way in hell I would be doing any of this without my support system. Support systems are vital for anyone, but especially for people who are as vulnerable as many or most trans people are. Coming out for me was not an act of courage, it was an act of desperation. And the support that I received allowed me to step out just a little further. And with each step I took, I was met with overwhelming love, validation, and support from my friends, my family, and my community. And I'm here today because of that love and support. And I'm the person I am today because of that love and support. Coming out was the single most terrifying thing I've ever done in my life. It's a rare occasion that something as personal as that gets broadcast to the general public in that way. But if I was going to deal with who I was, I didn't have a choice. Living my life as the person I've always known I truly was has been the most liberating and joyous experience of my life. It gets really bad sometimes between depression, dysphoria, anxiety, and the pressure that society places on me and others like me. But I've never been happier in my life. I've never been more comfortable in my own skin. I've never felt better about the way that I relate to people, and I've never felt more free. The problem with religion is not that its ideas are incorrect. There isn't a person in this room who hasn't been spectacularly wrong about something at some point in their lives. The problem with religion is dogma. Following a religion, in many or most cases, means subverting your own capacity for reason and judgment to an outside authority that hasn't deemed it appropriate to speak to us in centuries upon centuries upon centuries. So is it really any wonder that religions are generally so hostile to shedding the dogma that surrounds gender and sexuality? The dogma of one man, one woman, or born a man, always a man, born a woman, always a woman. These concepts don't exist because they're good ideas. They don't exist because they're likely to make people's lives any better or happier. These dogmas exist because a religion said so. And to speak out against the dogmas surrounding gender and sexuality is very directly to speak out against the outmoded thinking of Bronze Age philosophers about who we are and who we should love. I believe with all of my heart that the secular community is the place to be for equality. It's we as secular humanists, as atheists, as free thinkers, who can look at our queer and trans family and say, all I need to know about you is that you're a human being. You deserve equality simply by virtue of existing. As atheists, we know that religion has been and continues to be an impediment to almost all human progress. It's by fighting the notion that faith is a good way to know things, and by embracing reason that we allow ourselves to see our fellow human beings for who they truly are. I couldn't begin to say enough good things about the atheist community, and not only the way that I've seen us embrace this change, but the way I've seen us be a part of making this change happen. So, as much as we have to celebrate, there's a lot more work that we have to do. The secular movement should be leading on these issues, and I believe that we can lead on these issues. I've seen, heard, and felt the love that this community is capable of, and so let us continue to stand with our queer family. Let's reach out, lift up, and embrace our transgender family, and push hard and without apology to full equality and freedom for all of us. We're a long way from it, but with you as allies, I know we'll succeed. Thank you.
Gaytheism 101 from the Carolina Secular Convention on October 3rd, 2015. I had a really, really great experience at that convention, and I just want to say again, thank you to Jennifer Lovejoy for booking me, and for Joey Kirkman for sponsoring me to be there. And I don't just say this because he sponsored me, but you really should check out his book, PR Pope. I got my copy, and it's awesome. The artwork is great. The book is great, and Joey is honestly, really and truly a really, really good guy. I got to spend some quality time with him this weekend too, and there are just a lot of amazing people in the secular movement, and it behooves anyone who gets the opportunity to get to know some of these folks, because you will find yourself very quickly, very, very quickly among family. Next week's episode is going to cover National Coming Out Day. We're going to have a special guest co-host. I'm not ready to announce who it is yet, but she's someone you may have heard of. I'm really, really excited to have her. So if you would like to have your coming out story featured on the show, please do email thegaytheistmanifesto@gmail.com or find me on Facebook, Callie Wright, or, post to our Facebook page, get a hold of us somehow. If you'd like to share your atheist or LGBT coming out story, we would love to hear it and talk about it on the show. So please do get in touch with us if you're interested in sharing that. And that, my friends, is going to do it for this episode of the Gaytheist Manifesto on Secular Media Network. You can find the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto. You can email us at thegaytheistmanifesto@gmail.com. I'm on Twitter at GaytheistCallie, and you can find the show on Twitter at The Gaytheist. Before we go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, and knows that you're capable of amazing things and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, this is The Gaytheist Manifesto.